Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. This is your week 6 in-depth lecture titled Distorted Senses Within Mediascapes. It is, of course, for the week of June 13th to June 19th. Ideally, you will have already watched the music videos and read the articles for this week prior to watching this lecture. If you've not already done so, I ask that you pause this lecture and then come back to it after you've done that preliminary work, as it will help to make sense of what is going on in this week's lecture, okay? All right, so what's on the agenda for today is concepts to write down and remember, and a discussion of primary and secondary sources that you have for this week. As always, these two bullet points are hyperlinked, which means that you are able to go directly to that section of the lecture if you were to view these Google Slides, obviously not in lecture format on YouTube, but if you go to the Google Slides themselves, you can click on the links and it will move you to the slides if you'd like to be redirected to those sections, right away. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with concepts to write down and remember. As a reminder, this week is the second to last week that you will have concepts to write down and remember, because we will then be moving forward with focusing on long form writing and working on the assignments that really comprise the majority of the points in your grade. Okay. Now, the first concept I have for you is capitalism, and I ask that you please pause and watch these videos. It will take you less than 10 minutes because you'll need to be familiar with this concept as you navigate the music videos, readings, and process post for this week. These are really helpful videos just to get a sense of how would you define capitalism, and provide some really good context. I purposely tried to find videos that are really short. I know it can be a bit of a chore to watch extra content beyond sort of looking at and listening to the lecture, but I implore you to do so because I've generally found that students feel more comfortable with the material when they engage with the secondary content, okay? I have provided here, though, a really teeny tiny definition for capitalism, just in case you didn't watch those videos, because, I don't have you in the classroom, so I don't know. But when we really boil it down, we can understand US capitalism to be an economic and political system in the United States that is for profit and based on competition in the market, wage labor, and private ownership. One of the kind of biggest features, or I guess cardinal features you could say, of capitalism is the prioritization of competition. One of the ways you can kind of think about this and recognize this at play is that if you look in the bottom right corner, you'll see logos for different supermarkets that people can shop at. When we consider how the US is organized, we oftentimes have a lot of the same things represented by different entities that kind of sell themselves on the opportunity of choice, right? Of perhaps by having a Kroger and a Giant Eagle located near your apartment, you have way more shopping options. And the competition between these two stores, might be productive because perhaps you go to one of them, realize you don't like it, then you end up going to the other, and so on and so forth, right? So it's really all about competition. It's about this idea that we should really prioritize purchasing things and really finding just self-worth and just kind of enjoyment and pleasure in purchasing things. But also kind of capitalism really implores us to think of ourselves as laborers, right? As somebody who first and foremost is a consumer, is a laborer, meaning that you work to live, but you also live to consume. And really it comes down to this sort of goal of having a lot of competition between, different businesses, different entities that, on a positive note, provide the consumer with a lot of different options to choose from. And on the negative side, also mean that everything is kind of really seen through the lens of profit, okay? Now, the consumer, which you've already heard me say this phrase a couple of times here, is a person who purchases goods or services based on need or desire. Now, a lot of times when we think about how society is organized, this is a primary label that will be used for individual people, right? That your relationship to the system is in part based on what you consume, how often you go shopping, how often you use certain services, especially when we get into subscription-based services, this becomes even more dominant in a way, because not only do you have sort of people who are consuming on a regular basis, like going to the grocery store or getting gas for their car, but suddenly we also have kind of automatic consumption, like paying your Netflix bill every month on auto pay, and that's just sort of automatically being consumed by you each month, regardless of how much you use it, right? We also have the commodity, and this is a term I haven't used explicitly so far, but it's one that's really helpful, especially this week. And that's going to refer to an item that is produced by a corporation, business, or individual and is sold to a consumer. The commodity can fill a need or satisfy a desire. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that I've put an image of different kinds of, kind of fabric cleaner and just kind of like liquid that you would utilize to wash clothes in the washing machine, right? Now, arguably, all of them are the exact same product, but the label is going to indicate different benefits, whether it's a certain scent, or perhaps it's fragrance free, or it maybe, takes out tough messes or whatever it might be, right? The commodity is really this thing that an entity like a business, a corporation, or even kind of on a smaller scale, maybe even an Etsy shop, is really marketing to you and kind of really trying to build on your desire to perhaps own or consume things, or even just like your need for certain things to exist in your world. Now, where we can see kind of all three of these different, what is the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say concepts, but all three of these different kind of parts, let's say, of society working is in part through the mediascape. Now, we can think of the mediascape as a term that also could be interchangeable with visual culture, but basically a mediascape is a communications-based media that shows consumers a view of the world. So the mediascape is going to be kind of the interconnectedness of a bunch of different media pieces, okay? So for example, and these are, old screenshots. So like right here, this one's going to be out of date. But, if we look at some of the images I have for you here, we can think about parts of the mediascape as including something like, kind of what's trending on Twitter. It could be your news feed on Facebook, or kind of what people post to the grid on Instagram. It could be, kind of recommended posts that you get. It could be anthologies or collections or photography books like Brandon Stanton's Humans of New York, which is also a digital platform. It could be news media and broadcast media like BBC News, Fox News, CNN, ABC News, so on and so forth, right? It could be local journalism. It could also be kind of news and feature specials like This Is Life with Lisa Ling. There are plenty of different parts that comprise this mediascape, right? And it extends across mediums. It's not exclusively news media or exclusively in book form or exclusively social media. Sometimes people have been hesitant to recognize social media as a part of the mediascape, particularly earlier in kind of the early 2000s and early 2010s. But I think now in 2021, we're at a point where people are starting to recognize that the mediascape can't really be separated from social media, given that, studios, networks, individual celebrities, corporations, right? So many different entities that exist elsewhere in popular culture rely explicitly on social media to really be in touch with their consumer base. But we also see that social media allows the kind of everyday average person to also participate in the mediascape and potentially move up the rungs of it, like a Charlie D'Amelio or Addison Rae, right? And so the mediascape is really going to be kind of this digital world and print world, right? The interconnectedness of the print and the digital that really communicates a view of the world to the public at large. Conformity is a term that you likely are already familiar with, but it's one that relates to an individual's submission to and or acceptance of rules set by a larger institution or system like education, religion, the internet, or national government. Now, conformity is really going to be about kind of, both visible and invisible pressures. If we think about a visible pressure to conform, we can think about the physical layout of a classroom space where we have all of the desks and chairs laid out in a particular way, right? Now, if we look at how this classroom is organized, what may or may not be obvious or kind of subtle, depending on your positionality, is how this classroom is organized to kind of have a uniform number of desks and chairs. And each of these chairs is built the same way, right? But not all of these chairs are going to support or be comfortable to every body that were to sit in it, right? These chairs definitely are prioritizing thinner bodies, smaller bodies, but these chairs are also prioritizing folks who are not wheelchair users, for example. Like if we think about if a chair and desk are kind of always going to be connected in such a way, somebody who's a wheelchair user would not be able to sit in this space and still have access to a desk surface in the same way that they would be able to if they were able-bodied and could walk and sit down into that chair, right? So that's kind of an example of like a visible or invisible pressure to conform, in that the way that the classroom is laid out might imply that only certain bodies should be accepted in or just are made comfortable in a given space. Another example of conformity we can think of would be Facetune and just kind of like cosmetic procedures and fillers. I've included the screenshot of James Charles. I want to mention that this image of James Charles was one that I've used prior to like the scandals and just things surrounding him in the past few months. I honestly forgot that this screenshot was here. I would have used someone else. But kind of on this note, YouTubers, especially in the beauty YouTube space, like James Charles or Nikita Dragon, are definitely ones who explicitly talk about kind of being avid users of and fans of Facetune and filler and cosmetic procedures and so on and so forth. And so in thinking back to the Gia Tolentino article, we can definitely see resonances of conformity in terms of how people manipulate their features to look a particular way. And if we understand Gia Tolentino's argument, in part, some of what she's saying is we can understand that conformity to the beauty ideal right now is partially about looking ambiguously brown, but it still remains really anti-Black in the sense that it's like, you know, ways that people are conforming to a beauty standard that still upholds whiteness and white features, even as it is integrating an ambiguous kind of brownness into it through kind of manipulating skin tone, through spray tanning, right, filters, so on and so forth. And finally, I include this graphic here of Ariana Grande from her Focus music video, just because I think the body language we get throughout this video of being kind of in proximity to technology is a helpful visual. And we can also recognize that in music videos, there's a lot of effort placed on product placement, as this is a key way that corporations and advertisers try to convey what's going to be kind of the best way to technologically fit into society as well. I wanted to also briefly mention that when we talk about conformity, not only is the Gia Tolentino article helpful for talking about, Instagram face as a phenomenon that kind of tracks how people change their features over time to look like this contemporary beauty ideal in a really problematic way, but we can also recognize that conformity is something that we can kind of see at play with stars as they navigate Hollywood. I've included images here of Jennifer Lopez, or J-Lo, and some of her costuming and looks from 1990 to 2020. And the reason I've done this is because sometimes it's not always obvious to our eyes, or it's kind of intentionally obscured from view. But celebrities like J-Lo oftentimes undergo really just kind of radical, diet regimens. They undergo really substantial kind of cosmetic changes, or again, there sometimes are occasions where they're kind of spray tanning or changing their skin tone to look different ways. But oftentimes we also see a kind of texturism in Hollywood, right? That like if we have a J-Lo here who's, featured at the beginning of her career when she was a fly girl with kind of curlier and wavier hair, we can see progressively that she wears her hair straight and much lighter as her career goes on. And this is very common for Latina celebrities in particular. Jennifer Lopez is Nuyorican, she's a Puerto Rican from the Bronx in New York. And one of the things we can kind of see throughout her career is that she, gradually lightens her hair, which affords her more opportunities to play characters who are also white, right? But also kind of gives us insight into how some women of color, some Latinas, some Asian women, some Black women, et cetera, kind of possess a racial mobility, meaning that they're able to kind of transform or change themselves to fit a part or to fit a role. And this is not true for all performers, right? And so sometimes we can see that women of color or, celebrities with white privilege or lighter skin privilege are able to kind of manipulate features to match what the beauty ideal is at a given time. And so I include J-Lo here as an example to think about the pressures that are especially placed on Asian, Latina, and Black women to conform to a white beauty standard in some eras. And then in other eras, we start to see that white beauty standard change, especially if we think about the fact that in a contemporary beauty ideal, it's much more ideal to be curvy, though those curves are still really concentrated to kind of idealize locales on the body. But one of the major conflicts for J-Lo early in her career, particularly in 2002, is that because she was curvy, specifically specifically having a career, but there was a lot of critiques from the media that she was too excessive and too hypersexual. And so depending on what the contemporary beauty ideal looks like, we can also recognize that there are different consequences and different pressures put on women to be smaller, especially women of color, to not be ridiculed or not kind of perceived of as being excessive or hypersexual, all of which are stereotypes about women of color. I also included some examples of kind of evolutions of X Factor contestant Cher Lloyd in her costuming and looks from 2010 to 2013, and Princess Nokia, her costuming and looks from 2010 to 2021. Princess Nokia is a rapper. Cher Lloyd was, like I said, an X Factor contestant. I included these also because when we think about conformity, and just also thinking about kind of being visible in the public eye, it's not uncommon for celebrities to change their looks when they're doing different projects and to kind of recognize and visualize different eras in their career. We see this a lot with Taylor Swift, that she'll kind of undergo like a haircut or a makeup change or a costuming change to really recognize and visually index who she is at a particular period of time. But one of the reasons I wanted to include here Cher Lloyd and Princess Nokia is because in each of these cases, we have really dramatic kind of physical changes that occur. With Cher Lloyd, we have her, when she starts out as a contestant, she gets a lot of critiques about not looking enough like a pop star. And so gradually over time, they actually completely change her teeth. They end up doing her makeup really differently. Her costume is different, hair is different, right? And just kind of, we can see that over time, there's a lot of kind of physical manipulations done to her body so that she conforms more closely to a contemporary beauty ideal in the early 2010s. And she really kind of, is expected to undergo these things at this point as a requirement of wanting to pursue this career option. Now, if we look at Princess Nokia, who is really well known for kind of changing her look for each era of her career, but especially like for different music videos, she really is able to transform and kind of chameleon to match, kind of the messaging and focus of a particular text. There's also been some criticism of her of kind of arguing that she is really kind of going from someone who really embraced being a tomboy, not being a conventional beauty, as she argued, and just kind of not having the body type that typically is associated with beauty, even though she had a thin body, to now like having a much curvier figure and doing her makeup in ways that also situate her as more conventionally beautiful. And so across these two examples, we can kind of see evidence for how there is a pressure to conform to these beauty ideals that's not abstract, but is, not only coming from corporations and studios, right? But it's also, or in labels, I should say, but it's also coming from kind of pressures from audiences who will potentially ridicule or mock, especially women celebrities, if they don't kind of adhere to a beauty standard and don't look the part to kind of gain the success that they want. Another really kind of useful example is Ariana Grande's costuming and look evolution from 2010 to 2020. She, of course, starts out on Nickelodeon. And when we see kind of the evolution of her moving from Nickelodeon, much like Disney stars moving from Disney Channel to other projects, in Ariana Grande's case, of course, that's moving into music, we can see that she kind of tries to develop a distinct style. Not only, of course, does she have kind of the iconic ponytail, for a time she's wearing cat ears everywhere, but we also see that kind of briefly she's very avidly into spray tan, and is kind of a key example referenced when people talk about blackfishing, and sort of the ways in which white women will kind of take on spray tanning or other kinds of, kind of physical manipulations or cosmetic manipulations as a way to appear ambiguously brown at times when it seems desirable, and then at other times kind of fade back into whiteness, as we can see here. This all brings me to this point of autonomy and agency. And autonomy and agency are terms that kind of identify what it means to be independent, to be in control of one's own actions, decisions, and self. An individual's personal power is impacted by larger systems such as society at large, various social institutions, and legal documents/contracts. So the example I pulled here, of course, is Britney Spears, someone we looked at the text Lucky from in a previous week. But I especially wanted to include this example because in thinking back to Britney Spears, she's someone who really embodies the duality sometimes that can be associated with autonomy or the complexity of autonomy or agency in popular culture. In that, Britney Spears' brand when she starts out is she really embodied the kind of hybridity of, if women were being reduced to two options of either kind of the virgin or whore, Britney Spears was really embracing and mixing those two together. And in doing so, she was kind of really embracing her sexuality in ways that were not commonly seen in pop culture at the time, but she was also maintaining a very cute and kind of like girly persona that was often perceived of as the antithesis of being sexual and sexually empowered. Now, of course, even though the content of Britney Spears's lyrics and just like her music videos and so on have always really embraced this kind of autonomy over the self as a driving force and theme, we understand now, of course, through texts like framing, like framing Britney Spears and just kind of how her how her legal battles have gone on just over time. We can understand that, she doesn't necessarily have the like autonomy in her kind of legal affairs that we might have assumed her to have, right? The conservatorship and other things that have come out about just kind of how the people around her respond to her mental health and just respond to her as someone who is in possession, of course, of a lot of money. We can see that, somebody's brand might be based around autonomy or agency, but their lived experience might not necessarily reflect that. That's not always the case, but it can definitely be both things being true at the same time. This also brings us to girl power. And girl power, is kind of a phrase that's used, at random or kind of will be used in passing, but it's actually a really important driving force for how we can see pop culture interacting with and responding to women over time, especially with white women, typically the ones centered at the forefront of girl power. Now, girl power can be a positive recognition of girls and women as any of the following: being leaders in society, in control of their own sexuality, body, and brand, in control of their own image and look, being visible and creative to the public on their own terms, proud of their talents and abilities, in control of their personal life, business ventures, and being strong, competitive, and inventive. And so really when it comes to girl power, we're thinking about, kind of this recognition of girls as being in control, again, having autonomy and agency to some extent, and really being a force that, drives the economy in terms of owning businesses or being kind of in control of their catalog or taking back their catalog in the case of Taylor Swift, or just kind of being role models or being ideals to girls and women and femme identified folks. We definitely see a rise in girl power content in the 90s with the Spice Girls and Powerpuff Girls and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And as we start to see more content that kind of has girl protagonists, but we especially now kind of see a continuous embrace of this term, especially through the lens of girl bosses. Definitely girl power can be problematic, especially if girl power is sort of enforced by cis folks and exclusionary to trans folks, which is obviously not ideal and is very oppressive. But girl power can also be, like I mentioned before, something that really upholds white women to the detriment of women of color, in that sometimes the girl power argument is kind of a way in which white women have been able to kind of set boundaries around who gets included in these roles and hasn't always opened these roles up to women of color and trans women. Christina Aguilera is one artist who really kind of utilized the combination of girl power and autonomy and agency in her career, especially as she transitioned away from being kind of the squeaky clean pop star as you see on the left. Her and Britney Spears definitely faced a lot of pressure to just really be kind of the bleached blonde, perfect pop star, bubblegum pop specifically, even though in content, Christina Aguilera's lyrics were always kind of exploratory in terms of sexual liberation. And by the time she transitions away from something like Genie in a Bottle in 1999 and moves to Dirty in 2002, you can see that obviously costuming, hair, dance like slash choreography, right? Singing, everything has really evolved into being in control, being in power, and kind of, again, really embracing that duality of kind of the virgin whore complex that up until then in pop culture had been really restrictive to women, of saying you are one or the other, and there are benefits to being the virgin and kind of punishments associated with being the whore. We see also in kind of more recent texts like 3435 Remix and Best Friend, that kind of sexual empowerment and liberation is, really in vogue in terms of kind of how women in music are declaring autonomy and agency. We can see, of course, that like something that kind of helps us to, in some ways, visualize this sense of empowerment is kind of women in possession of the camera, whether that's a smartphone camera, as we see here, or a kind of video camera, as we see here. If we recognize that some of the tools that are utilized so that folks are in control of their own image and how it's distributed are things like social media and kind of your personal smartphone and cameras and so on, the kind of appearance of these kinds of tech in music videos is a really useful way for kind of visualizing this phenomenon. But also what's useful to think about here is that whereas with Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera in the 90s and early 2000s, we have a focus on kind of the individual woman as being empowered. We see in the kind of late 2010s and early 20s, as we start out in the 2020s, that there's more of a concentration on kind of best friendship and a recognition that it doesn't need to be exclusively one woman succeeding for empowerment to occur. This brings me, though, to this concept of materialism. And materialism is, something that doesn't necessarily have the same kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess positive context. Positive connotations, that's the word, positive connotations as girl power or autonomy and agency, even though those other terms can become, really complex, right? Anyways, with materialism, this is going to reflect a consumer's heightened desire for enjoyment of or sense of fulfillment associated with owning material and items beyond what they need or occasionally desire. And so with materialism, we definitely see kind of the social media influencer at the forefront of the materialism kick. Not to say that they invented it, but they definitely have embraced it and been successful in folding it into their personal self brands. So I've got examples here of folks like Jeffree Star and Jaclyn Hill, also problematic if you follow YouTube beauty culture. Nevertheless, important driving forces in kind of how we see materialism taking shape. Also, Gabby DiMartino and plenty other beauty YouTubers are really, I guess, successful, you can say, in building their content around, having a lot of stuff and filming their stuff and showing their stuff. Kylie Jenner also does this too. Of course, we get a lot of closet tours of the rich and famous on YouTube. But really what it comes down to, right, is materialism is all about really finding a sense of self in buying stuff, having stuff, wanting stuff, right? Stuff is at the heart of desire when it comes to materialism. And the individual really just like individual as consumer, an individual really feeling like, wow, yes, I love this. This is like everything I've ever wanted and dreamed of. Yeah, it's a lot, both literally and figuratively. All right. And then consumerism is going to relate to something a little bit bigger than materialism. So if materialism is all about the individual consumer's desire to have and just get more stuff, consumerism is kind of a active push by corporations and the larger system that consumers should continuously purchase goods and services. So we want to think about things like Black Friday, thinking about, all of the tags and things you see at the grocery store that are like buy two, get one free. All of the different, kind of commercials and sale days and things that are designed to really encourage you to want more stuff. That's going to be kind of the level above materialism. Materialism is going to be an individual relationship to stuff. Consumerism is a systemic, structural driving push for the individual to want to see themselves as consumer and to want stuff. Now, another term that's going to be really important for this week is appropriation. And we're going to kind of get into the, I guess, nuances of this a little bit, because we're talking about both appropriation and cultural appropriation this week. So appropriation, in looking to the pop art article that you read for this week, or kind of entry that you read for this week, appropriation is the intentional borrowing, copying, and alteration of existing images and objects. It's a strategy that has been used by artists for millennia. It took on new significance in the mid-20th century with the rise of consumerism and the proliferation of images through mass media outlets from magazines to television. So appropriation is, a term that obviously shares a base with cultural appropriation, but the connotations are a little bit different. Appropriation we can understand as a strategy or a technique, okay? And it's a technique or strategy that's used by a creator. And I'm going to use creator here as my kind of go-to term, namely because, when I think of a creator, that can be anything from a content creator on social media to an artist, to, somebody who's making film, so on and so forth, right? But appropriation is about being intentional in deciding that you're going to take something from somewhere else and incorporate it into something new, right? So for example, on the right, we have this kind of image of Marilyn Monroe, where we can see that, like, recognizably, that's Marilyn Monroe, but Andy Warhol has kind of changed the, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of the color scale, and changed how her face is represented so that it's repeated, but it looks different in each of those images, right? Similarly, Roy Lichtenstein, below we have this image that I love that says, "I don't care, I'd rather sink than call Brad for help." And we can kind of see him appropriating the comic book style into how he's presenting and kind of doing his art over time. And so again, this is a strategy or technique that's intentionally being used, right? The creator knows that they're taking whatever strategy or technique, or sometimes even inspiration or image, right? And they're utilizing it in such a way that they can produce a social commentary about consumerism. So again, thinking back to the slides that we just talked about of materialism and consumerism, artists who are using appropriation in this way in pop art are really focused on understanding what the rise in consumerism in the mid-20th century, so we're talking 1950s, 1960s, right? What that did to the United States and kind of pop culture more broadly, okay? And they're really intentionally focusing on spaces like mass media outlets, from magazines to television to advertisers, so on and so forth, okay? Now, the pop art entry goes on to say that pop artists reveled in reproducing, juxtaposing, and repeating everyday images from popular culture in their wide-ranging work. In doing so, they both mirrored and critiqued the ideas, desires, and cultural trends of their time. As Andy Warhol stated, pop artists did images that anyone walking down the street would recognize in a split second: comics, picnic tables, men's pants, celebrities, refrigerators, Coke bottles. So I've got a couple examples over here. Once again, if we look at some of the kind of inspiration points, we've got Campbell's soup, we've got soda bottles like 7-Up, if you look really closely right there. We've got plenty of groceries. You can even see some Kellogg's Rice Krispies right there, some Dole pineapple, and so on and so forth, right? So the goal is that you're taking something that is going to be recognizable to the general public, and you're reinterpreting it or translating it in a new way that's going to have some kind of impact that provokes a sense of thought about kind of, society, consumerism, so on and so forth, okay? Now, cultural appropriation, which might be a term that's a bit more familiar, but can be kind of hazy depending on how you've arrived at it, is a term that recognizes that when a member of a dominant or privileged group adopts a characteristic or item created by a marginalized group and either gets credited for its invention and receives praise, or uses this characteristic or item in an offensive way, sometimes both at the same time. This individual from the dominant group will not get the same responses as the original marginalized creator, who these characteristics or items actually belong to. The original creator often is discriminated against and or ridiculed for this feature or item. So the Kardashian-Jenners are pretty commonly associated with cultural appropriation, especially when we think to the fact that, in past weeks, we've been kind of talking about stereotypes that get projected onto Black, Asian, and Latina women. One of which is that being, bigger or excessively curvy has not always been seen as sexually desirable. In fact, much of the time we have seen that historically to be curvy has been a way that violence has been rationalized against Black women. And we also see that kind of Native women also face stereotypes surrounding kind of just really harmful narratives about suggesting that Native women are sexually kind of more available than other women. And so when we recognize that these kinds of stereotypes and harmful narratives have led to, violence and violation against women of color and Indigenous women and so on and so forth, we can also then readily recognize that, when it comes to casting in Hollywood or success in Hollywood, oftentimes the contemporary beauty ideal has also decided who gets what roles. And so if historically we see that Black, Asian, Latina, Indigenous women, so on and so forth, have not been as kind of successful at being able to get roles or achieve kind of A-list celebrity success, when we see the Kardashian Jenners as a family who has kind of been successful in manipulating their features in such a way that they get praised for different hairstyles and just kind of different bodily features, we can see that there's kind of a double standard there, right? Of when Kylie Jenner, kind of initially decided to get lip filler and denied it for a long time, and then eventually was like, okay, I did it, and then launches this whole lip kit empire around it. We can see how, Kylie Jenner as a white woman oftentimes has appropriated Black styles, Black features, Black hair in such a way that's kind of meant to make her look edgy or risque, which we'll talk more about next week. Kim Kardashian West, or Kim Kardashian as she'll soon be known as, definitely has also done this as well, primarily with kind of Black hairstyles, with changing her skin tone, with manipulating her silhouette, so on and so forth. And Gwen Stefani is another example of this as well. She's oftentimes been really aggressively appropriating things like bindi, different hairstyles, chola subcultures, so on and so forth, right? But the message here is that with cultural appropriation, the idea is that folks who are in a dominant kind of or privileged group, such as white folks, when they adopt a characteristic or item that is either created by or possessed by members of a marginalized group, the group that's in a position of power are going to get celebrated for it and credit for it, whereas folks who, typically wear this style, have this style, invented this style, don't get the same structural success. And if you're questioning kind of what is some of the evidence or support that there is indeed benefits for white women who do this work, think about the fact, or even Google how much money that Kylie Jenner made off her lip kits, right? Kim Kardashian, a similar thing. Kim Kardashian is, in addition to doing tons of, makeup enterprises and so on and so forth, her shapewear is also an example of how we can see her kind of profiting off of body manipulation. Yeah, there's a lot. I've included some other examples here of how we can see cultural appropriation in media, other examples of Gwen Stefani, once again, appropriating bindi, dressing as a Native woman, which is really inappropriate, especially because, as we can also see with this Pharrell image here from this cover of Elle, oftentimes what happens with Indigenous fashions and Indigenous just kind of self-adornment practices is that the different items that get appropriated by a mainstream white creator, or sometimes not even a white creator, are taken out of their context. And so sometimes it's sacred items that are being worn to look edgy or cool. And that can be deeply, deeply offensive, right? Bo Derek, who famously appropriated this hairstyle, and they were then referred to as Bo Derek braids problematically by white women, is kind of a clear-cut example of this. Kim Kardashian refers to some of the hairstyles that she'll wear by terminology that's incorrect, sometimes referring to things as Bo Derek braids. Katy Perry has really consistently appropriated various Asian cultures and just kind of worn costumes, kind of in thinking about like costuming, right, as a really important feature of how an artist tells a story. She's oftentimes kind of translated different, silhouettes and items into costumes, which is really, really problematic. And then similarly, we can see here as well with Selena Gomez, she got a lot of flack for appropriating bindi and other things as well. Now, I included some screenshots here, especially just to kind of supplement the past slides, because we don't necessarily have the time that we need to cover everything. But these are just some kind of examples of kind of why it's significant, especially when white women wear Black hairstyles just to look edgy and cool, because it remains a legal battle for Black women to wear natural hair to work without it being straightened or manipulated. And especially we see this even as young as children are kind of demonized and chastised for wearing their hair as it naturally grows out of their head, as that being a kind of violation of the dress code. And so we want to really be thoughtful about the fact that if it is criminalized and criticized for Black women to wear their hair as is, and white women are celebrated publicly for wearing Black hairstyles, there's clearly a disparity at work there. I also included a link to a time feature from 2021 that really tracks the Kardashian-Jenner legacy of Blackfishing and appropriation. I've also included some screenshots here, right? We definitely don't have enough time to go into everything, but there is plenty. I've had students write about the Kardashian-Jenners in the past because there is so much to focus on. So if this is an area of interest for you, it's definitely something you might want to consider pursuing in the later weeks when we talk a little bit more about kind of the final project and just primary sources more broadly. Now, cultural appropriation is a focus in the Spencer Kornhaber article, and I'm not going to go too exhaustively through this article in my lecture because this lecture, of course, is already very lengthy, but I did want to highlight one of the points that he makes where he says, appropriation remains one of the hardest to talk about phenomena in pop culture, which is fundamentally a hodgepodge of widely circulated ideas that originated in specific subcultures. One line of thought puts it in economic terms. Are marginalized creators being materially harmed and erased? But on another level, there are questions of aesthetics and tastes. Does the pop star draw upon her influences in a way that feels original? Does her work disrespect or honor these influences? Is there a double standard in how her work is received? Now here, of course, he's concentrating specifically on Ariana Grande and the cultural appropriation backlash she received after Seven Rings, but really across her kind of Sweetener and Thank You Next eras. And I just want to kind of note, you'll see here that he makes reference to Miley Cyrus as well, who we will be talking about next week, who definitely also has been accused of cultural appropriation. And something I just want to kind of just mention here as you kind of are working through this article, that again, positionality really matters, but we also want to think about profit. In thinking back to capitalism as a concept, if capitalism as an economic thing is really driving people to want to make as much money as possible, to make a successful brand, to really situate themselves in such a position that they are able to kind of monetize themselves in various things really effectively, we want to consider how cultural appropriation then becomes a strategy through which specifically white people are able to benefit from various cultures without actually being of those cultures, right? And so it's a really sticky and tricky and messy issue, but one that causes a lot of harm, but also can result in a lot of profit for white folks specifically. I've included this video here of 7 myths about cultural appropriation debunked from MTV Decoded. Francesca Ramsey is fantastic and really awesome at talking through concepts in short, compact ways. Please watch this. It will help. It is really useful, and it's very important to understand what cultural appropriation is because it is something that is so pervasive and sometimes gets written off as normal, and therefore you might be accidentally culturally appropriating and not know. So this is something to be well versed in. No, I don't know why it started playing. Sorry. I also have this documentary from Elle, and it's about braids and appropriation. It's a little bit longer, but it's really excellent and super well done. So I also encourage you to watch this as well. Okay, cut that one before it played longer. Oh my Lord. Okay, so let's move then to a discussion of primary and secondary sources. This will be very quick and brief, but I just wanted to kind of walk through a few things. So Marina and the Diamonds is, of course, one of the creators you are looking at for today. You're looking at two texts, Hollywood and Oh No. I wanted to mention that Marina is not a US born or US based creator. At least I don't think she's US based still. She is a Welsh creator, but she talks about the US quite a bit in her writing. And her full name is Marina Diamandis, but she used the stage name Marina and the Diamonds for the first half of the 2010s. She's since transitioned to using Marina pretty much exclusively, but I used Marina and the Diamonds here because that was the title at the time of the production of these videos. She is really interested in elements of pop art, in elements of Hollywood. popular culture, even on her most recent album that was just released last week, I believe it was. She is still really talking a lot about kind of US popular culture and Hollywood and social commentary and women's role in society. But things I want you to really be attentive to as you prepare to write your process post is, how is she doing things that are really explicit in terms of kind of obvious connections to Americanness, right? If we think about the American flag as something that's very iconic for good and bad reasons, I want you to kind of think about what is significant about her having the American flag and red, white, and blue color scheme kind of drenched throughout this music video. If we think back to week 2, when we were thinking about patriotism, definitely Marina's Hollywood video shares some commonality there in terms of strategy, right? The form is definitely drenched in Americanness in terms of the color scheme and costuming and so on and so forth. So I really want to see you bring some of that into your discussion of how she's defining Americanness visually, and make sure you're connecting that to her lyrical explorations, because they have a little bit of a different tone than what we see on screen. Same thing goes for Oh No. We can definitely see her kind of blatantly bringing in things like dollar bills and office spaces. And we can also see text like POW, which hopefully after talking about geometrizing and storyfying already kind of feels like a connection point back to comics and zine week. But I really want you to explore kind of how she's using just material items to really surround her in these music videos and allow her to make these social commentaries potentially more complicated or just kind of impactful than if they had remained just songs, okay? The Family Jewels, which is the album that these two songs come from, was released in 2010, and it was her debut album. And I mention this because debut albums can be really important in thinking about how the artist is kind of introducing themselves to the industry. I've included 3 interviews on this slide, which you can access by clicking on any of the 3 click here hyperlinked links. Hyperlinked links, you get it. Point is that if you're interested, she really talks about how she's talking about Americanness at these points, and especially since she is a Welsh artist, as someone who's not residing in the US, how is she thinking through these commentaries on and critiques of Americanness? And it's important to remember that discussions about Americanness are not exclusive to people residing in or born in the United States, okay? And I included this excerpt from an interview where she says, I think many people living outside of America felt its impact and influence growing up. MTV was the neon window into another life, another world where everything seemed better. America is very much an illusionary country. I love Americans and dearly. They are some of the friendliest, most open, hopeful people I've ever met. Yet there are many contradictory parts to its culture and to the messages it puts out. There is an unhealthy way in which people are valued. Who gives a shit about the old or the poor? You are more valued if you are youthful, beautiful, successful, etc. This is not normal in European countries, in my opinion. America puts such focus on being happy, yet people seem emptier than ever before. And as we all know, if you try and chase happiness, it rarely comes. So this gives some insight into what she's thinking about as she's crafting these songs about Americanness and US pop culture and society. So just kind of take those with you as you are preparing to analyze. You also have a video this week from Saweetie, much earlier in her career. I want you to really be attentive to the limited visuals we have here. This video is definitely really effective in terms of how it's communicating its message, but it's not using the abundance and excessiveness that we see in something like Seven Rings, right? It's definitely a lot more focused in. We have a single character that we're seeing the whole time, of course, being the protagonist narrator, Saweetie. I want you to just really think about costuming and lighting, and location is going to be really important here. How is the message of the song communicated in this text without having to do way too much, okay? Ariana Grande, you have 2 texts from this week, and of course you have the companion piece article by Spencer Kornhaber. I elected to give you Seven Rings and Positions because I think each of them provide really interesting explorations of girl power from very different lenses. I encourage you to think very much about setting, because setting in each case is really important, but also consistent across Ariana Grande's texts we see here is kind of an ensemble cast, meaning that she has background dancers and kind of background characters that are showing up and really playing different roles within the story world of her music videos. So I want you to really pay attention to those things, but also really pay attention to the fact that the lighting is vastly different, costuming is vastly different, right? But also kind of her proximity to material objects in the Seven Rings video has a lot of layers to them, as Spencer Kornhaber really explores and goes into detail on. And then finally, you have a music video from Lizzo. This, of course, is a single that really catapulted Lizzo, I think, to kind of mainstream attention. Not that she didn't have kind of a really loyal fan base prior to this point, but this was really something that got mainstream attention. And so I want you to really be attentive here to how she's putting different aspects of pop culture on display, and specifically different aspects of the mediascape, right? So really pay attention to where televisions show up. How is she incorporating, cell phones, different television shows, right? Different types of shows, so on and so forth, into her explorations of kind of what it means to be empowered and kind of in control. So that is everything I have for you this week in English 1110. I hope that this lecture was helpful for you as you've started to think through all of these different concepts and have started to apply them to your close readings. And I look forward to seeing everything that you come up with this week. All right, I'll talk to you all again soon. Bye.